International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrants Workers and Members of Their Families, adopted by General Assembly Resolution 45/158 of December 18, 1990. Entry into force, July 1, 2003, in accordance with Article 87, 1. Preamble: the states parties to the present convention, taking into account the principles embodied in the basic instruments of the United Nations concerning human rights, in particular the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Taking into account also the principles and standards set forth in the relevant instruments elaborated within the framework of the International Labour Organization, especially the Convention Concerning Migration for Employment, No. 97. The Convention Concerning Migrations in Abusive Conditions and the Promotion of Equality of Opportunity and Treatment of Migrant Workers, No. 143, the Recommendation Concerning Migration for Employment, No. 86, the Recommendation Concerning Migrant Workers, No. 151. The Convention Concerning Forced or Compulsory Labor, No. 29, and the Convention Concerning Abolition of Forced Labor, No. 105. Reaffirming the importance of the principles contained in the Convention Against Discrimination in Education of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Recalling the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. The Declaration of the Fourth United Nations Congress on the Prevention of Crime and the Treatment of Offenders, the Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement Officials, and the Slavery Conventions, recalling that one of the objectives of the International Labour Organization, as stated in its constitution, is the protection of the interests of workers when employed in countries other than their own, and bearing in mind the expertise and experience of that organization in matters related to migrant workers and members of their families. Recognizing the importance of the work done in connection with migrant workers and members of their families in various organs of the United Nations, in particular in the Commission on Human Rights and the Commission for Social Development, and in the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization and the World Health Organization, as well as in other international organizations. Recognizing also the progress made by certain states on a regional or bilateral basis towards the protection of the rights of migrant workers and members of their families, as well as the importance and usefulness of bilateral and multilateral agreements in this field. Realizing the importance and extent of the migration phenomenon, which involves millions of people and affects a large number of states in the international community. Aware of the impact of the flows of migrant workers on states and people concerned, and desiring to establish norms which may contribute to the harmonization of the attitudes of states through the acceptance of basic principles concerning the treatment of migrant workers and members of their families. Considering the situation of vulnerability in which migrant workers and members of their families frequently find themselves owing, among other things, to their absence from their state of origin and to the difficulties they may encounter arising from their presence in the state of employment. Convinced that the rights of migrant workers and members of their families have not been sufficiently recognized everywhere and therefore require appropriate international protection. Taking into account the fact that migration is often the cause of serious problems for the members of the families of migrant workers as well as for the workers themselves, in particular because of the scattering of the family. Bearing in mind that the human problems involved in migration are even more serious in the case of irregular migration and convinced therefore that appropriate action should be encouraged in order to prevent and eliminate clandestine movements and trafficking in migrant workers, while at the same time assuring the protection of their fundamental human rights. Considering that workers who are non-documented or in an irregular situation are frequently employed under less favorable conditions of work than other workers and that certain employers find this an inducement to seek such labor in order to reap the benefits of unfair competition. Considering also that recourse to the employment of migrant workers who are in an irregular situation will be discouraged if the fundamental human rights of all migrant workers are more widely recognized and, moreover, that granting certain additional rights to migrant workers and members of their families in a regular situation will encourage all migrants and employers to respect and comply with the laws and procedures established by the states concerned, convinced, therefore, of the need to bring about the international protection of the rights of all migrant workers and members of their families, reaffirming and establishing basic norms in a comprehensive convention which could be applied universally, have agreed as follows.